Well, thanks everybody for coming to see us. We didn't think anybody would, to be fair, so it's nice that somebody did. We appreciate the organic movement is still pretty small, and it's sort of growing out from a little nucleus of sort of hardcore people. So yeah, the more we meet, the better for us. None of us are professional speakers. You know, we do growing in various different regards, but that's where our expertise is. We just really want to sort of try and give everybody the chance to sort of understand, you know, real soil and growing organically, but from a gardener's perspective rather than from a company's perspective or from a marketing perspective. DJ, have you seen his bag anywhere? All right, we'll wait for Darren to come back. So, yeah, my name's Ben. I work for Indoor Organics. We've been making specialist organic living soils for 3 or 4 years now. That all just came from our need to want to be able to do it ourselves, from what we'd seen happening in America mainly, sort of coming out of Northern California, and the whole kind of, you know, just how some of these guys are third generation. They're just using whatever's around them. They're not paying attention at all to the industry as we know it when it comes to bottle feeds and that whole kind of thing. And yet it seems they're producing some of the highest quality medicines at the moment. And, you know, that's kind of what we're focused on. So, yeah, in the need myself, I was like, oh, wow, this living soil. You know, the key for me was just the fact it could be reused. That was the only real thing that really got me into it. And just not having to buy and replace and throw away soil. So it was great. I was really interested, but trying to actually find the materials or even just trying to find it pre-made was next to impossible. So it was a case of hunting out various amendments all over the country and getting bits together and sort of initially just mixing it up in a bathtub in my flat sort of thing and starting from there. But that's where I started from, just doing it myself. It was hard, it was a ball ache, but it got to the point where I thought, well, if I'm interested, hopefully some other people are. If I can at least make it a bit easier for other people by chucking it all in one place. And, you know, that's kind of where I come from. And here we are now a few years later on, and we have sort of a range of different bag soils available to people, a whole range of different amendments, and obviously just trying to encourage more people to at least give it a try. And most people, when they do, you know, they don't turn back. So here I've got a couple of friends that I've sort of met along the way. Most of them are sort of customers of mine, but come from different backgrounds. Be it they're into organics already, or maybe they're into doing things synthetically and they've converted, or maybe they're just a brand new grower just starting from scratch. And, you know, all I'm going to do today is just sort of try and get some information out of these guys as to sort of, you know, where they came from, why they started, you know, what their challenges they may have had or what they've enjoyed about it, just to sort of give you guys a bit of a feedback on it all. Obviously, if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in at any point. This is just an open, like I said, interactive chat, really. None of us are experts. We don't really know what we're doing. We're just sort of making it up as we go along. So, yeah, that's kind of what we just want to hear, try to help all you lot. So I'll introduce everybody to start with. This is my friend Josh. Do you want to say anything right now? Okay. Next on the line is my friend Carl. And we did have a Darren, but he's got lost looking for his bags. If anybody finds that, please help him. You know, I've told you a little bit about where I come from and what got me into it. I don't know if, Josh, you feel comfortable just saying where you come from. And, you know, I don't know if you've always been an organic grower, if you've been salts and stuff before, but if you could give us an idea of maybe where you were starting to grow, if it's indoors, outdoors, and then sort of how you got from there to here, really, that'd be great.
Yeah. Basically, I started growing basically for my food, because I started changing my food, eating better. So I wanted to grow organic food, and obviously that was my reason for going into it. God, can you hear me? Hello? Yeah, so I got into organic growing basically for my food, because my food, I wanted to start eating healthier. So I thought I wanted to start growing a bit more food, because I was buying a lot from the supermarket and it wasn't really doing it for me, flavour-wise. So I switched to organics, and yeah, my food has improved. But it's just a learning curve. I'm learning a lot. I'm still new, but it's good.
Yeah, hello. Similar to Josh, really. Although I've always grown sort of organically, I started growing out of bottles, and then just struggled for different reasons. I mean, I always had quite good results, but just always felt like there was a better way. Sort of looking like at nature, you can obviously see how nobody goes and feeds a forest or anything like that. It just feeds itself. So it just sort of try to mimic that, and then obviously once the products became more available actually for us to just buy easily here in the UK, it just seemed like the obvious step to go to next. So yeah, that's kind of like why I've went over to that type of growing, really.
And that's kind of what we find, you know, obviously from my position, I get lots of people messaging me, asking me various questions, and everyone seems to have their different angle, why they grow or where they come from. You know, some people are, in it for their own needs, be it for, like I said, food or their own medicine or whatever it may be. Some people are doing it just because, it's what their grandparents have always done or whatever, and they kind of get into it that way. My grandparents always had allotments, never really paid too much attention to it. But this is kind of where we went a little bit wrong here, where actually, when we all started growing, we all just went and asked our grandparents how they did it. The first thing they probably tell you about is compost. And that's kind of what separates living soil and real soil from all this other sort of bagged soil on the market. And to be fair, most of this bagged soil isn't even soil, it's just peat with some perlite and maybe a bit of sort of slaughterhouse NPK to give it a boost. So it's not even soil to start with, and I don't know how many people understand, what we do to build a soil mix, and so what goes into it. But the key foundation is really that compost, because when we say living soil, that is what it's all about, the living part, the life that's within it. So you can take if any of you study Elaine Ingham or any of these people on the internet, you've probably heard this phrase where you can take a teaspoon of soil, or proper soil, and there'll be more microbes within that than there are stars in the galaxy. And that's just something that science has just overlooked forever. It's something that modern agriculture has completely overlooked. And it wasn't until you actually understand that and you think, well, actually, what do these things do in the soil? And kind of like, why are they there and why are they important? And it's when you look at nature and you say, well, how does nature work? Look at the forests. Who's putting can of nutrients on that? Nobody. It's doing pretty well. And that's the reality of it. Plants kind of know how to grow themselves. They don't need people to grow them. Just all you need to do is help facilitate that. And you look in nature, nature's taking care of that already. And nature doesn't want to waste anything. Nature wants to make sure everything's a closed loop. Nature makes sure everything's sort of always in its optimal health. And the only time you get any bad health in a natural situation is when something needs to be cleaned up, and that's when you get pathogens, and that's when you get pests, and you get stuff to come and clean up poor health. But in a real natural living environment, everything's balanced. So let's start with that. So when you say life, what happens when the leaves fall from the trees in the autumn and they settle on the forest floor? The first thing they do is they turn to like a sludgy sort of wet level, and that's basically where the bacteria will come in to start with and start breaking that down into its mineral constituents. From bacteria, then you get other sort of like bigger types of soil microbes, and that's the sort of the chain of life from protozoa to nematodes to sort of eventually you're going to get to wood lice and spiders and everything else, and then birds and then people, and that's the core of the whole chain. But it's all kind of designed based on something feeding on something else. So it is a bit of a dog-eat-dog world, and there's going to be a lot of death within that world, but within death comes life in that recycling system. So say the leaves come down, they get decomposed by the soil life, and the soil life returns all of that, what was plant material or animal matter, back into nutrients that the plant can use. And that's all we're really trying to do, is to say, actually, let's look at nature. Let's say when we have a question about growing, or we want to have a question about plant health, let's understand how it works in the real environment. And actually, you can recreate that indoors. And that's all we were trying to do, by actually kind of building a compost bin that is kind of like the forest floor that you're constantly feeding with organic matter that has worms in it and has all the microbes from the compost that keep it all cycling around. Like I said, that's where I come from. When I found I could get a body of soil, and providing it was alive and you could keep feeding it, it stays alive, and you just go round and round and round and round and round and round, and your soil health just improves, and the fertility improves, and the yields improve. And actually that suits everybody, because everyone's trying to reduce their costs and make things easier. And that's kind of, why I got into it. So, Darren, we missed you. Did you find your bag? Good, I'm happy. I really wanted to get Darren to come and talk, because he was one of the sort of our key converts, because he's always grown for a long, long time using salt bases and minerals and systems and all that sort of stuff. I finally convinced you to try a couple of bags soil, and he chucked it in, and he balls on the line sort of thing, had a little go at it, but sort of adapted quite well, and sort of I was surprised how quickly adapted. And before you know it, he was reblending it and getting it to a full no-till mix. So I wouldn't mind letting him talk a little bit about his journey from his old school tech to his new school tech, really, if that's all right, mate.
Yeah, so I was growing beforehand with cocoa, totally inert, in small pots, in flood and drain tables, feeding salt baits, nutrients, from all different brands. I've tried every brand you can think of. I work retail in a hydro store, so obviously I get a chance to try everything. Pretty much they're all the same thing in different labels. Sorry, all them lot out there, but it's true. But I was reluctant. I watched Ben doing it for a while, and I was reluctant because mainly the bugs. When I see all the bugs, and I'm used to having a clean room.
You thought things would be crawling everywhere, didn't you?
Yeah, and they are, no? But it's cool, because now when I look, if the bugs, I see bugs in my room now that I don't really know what they are, some of them, but if the plants look healthy, I'm not panicking.
Do they leave your pots though, or they mainly stay in the containers?
No, mainly in the containers, but if you move a container sometimes, some of the soil mites and stuff that I put in, you might see them scampering around and that, but yeah.
So when we talk about bugs, bugs obviously encompasses a large body of insects, shall we say, and that's one of the things that some people freak about. Even worms are a bit freaky to some people, but the reality is when you start working with nature, you find actually most of these guys are actually on your side and they're trying to help you and they're trying to keep your soil health in line. And it's only the odd occasion when maybe pests come in, and once you start to recognize those, there's only really a couple that tend to affect us, and they're quite easy to stay on top of. And like I said, by deploying live populations of predator mites, you can obviously help keep these things at bay even more so. So yeah, so you're getting used to the bugs.
Yeah. So I started off with just that living soil.
Just straight out the bag.
Yep, straight out the bag. No worms. I done a run with it. Was really pleased with the results. Really pleased, especially the finished product, the flavours and the smells. This was varieties I'd been growing for a while, hydroponically, which I always thought were nice, but there was definitely a big difference with growing organically. But then at the end of the cycle, and I looked and I had all these pots of dirt, I was thinking, really, do I want to get rid of all this and bring in another lot? So that's when I
Because that's kind of the thing, isn't it? Where one of the key sort of success factors with living soil, rather than when you're direct feeding with salts and minerals, you can basically grow in a rock wool cube, as you've probably seen, and just plug a drip into it and just direct feed, and therefore sort of root sort of size doesn't matter so much. Where with living soil, the key thing is the soil volume, and that's why we encourage people to use these big pots, at least sort of 40 litre, 50 litre pots, because that way you can go a good sized plant in it and it's got plenty of room to continue the cycling around. But of course the problem is if you convince someone to go from growing maybe in sort of 6.5 litre pots or in a hydro system to then filling their room with all this soil, expecting to throw it away, then like, oh fuck, I've now got all this soil I've got to throw away that is even more than I had before. So actually it kind of at that point you have a decision to make, and actually the natural decision is actually, well, why don't I just reuse this soil? And that's what you did, didn't you? So on the blower,
Yeah, basically I didn't know, I still know nothing about all this, but I just asked you what amendments I needed. You sent me a pallet, I mixed it up, we let it cook, and it did get all hot in the middle like you said it would. And then potted them back up, put a cover crop on. As soon as the cover crop was up, we put the plants in, a mulch on, and then from then on, we're on the third cycle now, and I just love it. The main thing I love, nothing but the end product leaves the site. So every leaf you pluck off, every stem you don't need, at the end of harvest, all your trash, you just put it on top and it's worm food, basically.
That's it, the zero waste element of it. And that's it, you can really close the loop, because when you think about actually what's the best thing to feed a plant with is the plant itself, because it's already mined all the minerals and the nutrients and stored it in itself. So when you return it back to the soil, it's already in the right balance for the next crop that comes through. Just like in nature, that's why it works so well, because it's just that closed loop of mineral nutrition cycling around and around and around and around. So Darren touched on a couple of specifics there, talking about mulch and talking about cover crops and some bits we can go into a little bit later on. But yeah, the main thing is the reason why you had to get yours and blend yours out is just, if you're going to go into a living soil system and you're thinking about reusing it, think long term from the start, because lots of people will sort of throw some stuff together and then they sort of get a few cycles in, they go, actually I should have sort of put more thought into that, I should have used a better quality this or a better quality that. And that's just when you think about things like, well, like for example, we produced a brand of soil called Eco Life, which is like a cut down version which includes perlite, which is great to try and meet a cost price, but the problem with it, it's great for single runs and 2 or 3 runs, but eventually it's going to break down. So we say, look, if you know you're going to use it long term, why not get some perlite in, some pumice in there from the start, or some buckwheat, something that's a lot more, a much denser aeration, sort of much bigger lump, and it doesn't break down. Just to think about that. But at the same time, it wasn't the end of the world to get it out, reblend some fresh nutrition into it, which is basically the same kind of stuff you use to make the soil anyways. Whatever you made the soil is, it just needs a little bit more of that going in there. And the best thing is, of course, the stuff that comes straight from nature. Anything plant-based, ideally, if you can grow it, you can forage it, nettles, alfalfa, comfrey, springtail, horsetail, any of these sorts of stuff. Look on the back of the Dragonfly products, look on our bags, we list everything we put in it. If you guys can go and collect stuff and make it yourself, and we would always recommend you do that. But that's the main thing, once you've got the soil blended up to a point where it's got the right structure, and it's got the right sort of water holding capability, and the right sort of aeration, it's got the right sort of amendments, once you add the life, some worms, and some compost, things just happen on their own and it just goes, doesn't it? So it's good to see you get to that point where you'd blended it, got it to know. And
I think one thing you have to get used to from coming from a hydro point of view is the watering, because you don't really have a wet and dry cycle like you would with hydro. You're kind of just trying to keep it at a nice moisture level all the time. And it sort of goes against the way I was taught to grow, because I've only really come from that background, do you know what I mean? But
Yeah, well, that's good. And also now you're into a no-till system now, aren't you, where you're recycling that soil second or third cycle in?
yeah, that's right, yeah.
Happy. Okay, brilliant. Thanks for that. I brought Josh in specifically because he's been growing no-till, but he does it in beds rather than containers. So you've probably seen these guys do it in huge beds, especially in the greenhouses. They get big beds. Now, the choice between bed and container is, like we said, it's all about soil volume. But the benefit of a bed is you're maximizing your volume, right? Once the plants go into it and they start putting their roots out and they start interacting and you start building up this mycorrhizal network and they start talking to each other, communicating, your yields just really start accelerating to a point where it'll probably outcompete even NPK-based stuff like salt-based stuff. So, but the challenge, of course, of having a bed is once it's in place, you can't move it. So, like some people like to pre-veg and then bring into a flower and do things that way. So there is a drawback to that. So that's why we say, look, if you can't use a bed, the next best thing is use the biggest size pots you can use. And realistically, you want to go big enough so it's going to do what you want, but not so big you can't move it. So normally about 15 gallon for one person on their own is a movable size. 4 days per meter, you've pretty much filled your floor with soil anyways. But you know, that's what lots of people tend to do. They'll do a few cycles in pots, and then they'll think, actually, why don't I just sort of chuck this all together in one big bed? And that's kind of what you did, didn't you, in the end? Well, you did it quite early on, actually, didn't you? You were just kind of jumped in with the beds.
I mean, yeah, I had beds and pots, but I found with the pots, they were drying out a lot more quicker, so I had to a lot more attention to them. But the beds, it's much better. You've got more space. It's the yield increase was incredible. It's just the water retention. It's just everything, but was just better about the beds, and that's why I switched to them.
Yours sub-irrigated as well?
Oh yeah, I'll do sips. So basically, my bed sits on a bed of pumice with some poles on each corner for aeration, and the worms will go down into the pumice and come back up, and they love it. It's amazing.
So as you can see, there's a number of different ways to achieve the same thing, but all you're really trying to do is create an even moisture content in that soil. You know, once you built it with the right sort of structure, you don't want it sort of getting overly wet, because obviously that suffocates the microbes, like by the being just they can't breathe because of the moisture. And likewise, you don't want to dry too much, because then they're going to sort of hibernate. So when you water it, they're going to come back, and it's sort of like this. The whole point of the living soil is once you've loaded up with those amendments and when the life's there, the way it works basically is the plant is in control of its growth, like I told you, not a person. And the way it controls it is it releases exudates into the soil, which is basically just a blend of carbohydrates, which it generates through photosynthesis. So everyone understands photosynthesis, plants using it to build in energy for carbohydrates, but it only uses a fraction of that carbohydrate for its own energy. Most of those carbohydrates are pumped into the soil to feed the soil. So that's exactly how living soil and life works with a plant, how plants work with it. So let's say plants in vegetative growth, it's going to be going into flowering. It knows it's going to be going to flowering. It doesn't need a human to work out. It just knows what it's doing. So it goes, right, I know I'm probably going to need a bit more of this mineral, a bit more of this mineral, and the common ones you're probably familiar with, a bit more P and a bit more K. So the plant will go, right, I need to get more P and more K. I need more P and more K available in the soil for me in mineral form for me to absorb it and get ready for flowering. So what it will do, it will release a different blend of exudates to attract a different kind of microbe, which will be able to break down a different kind of soil amendment with a different kind of enzyme to release that calcium or that magnesium or that potassium in a mineral form for that plant when it needs it, and it will just do a trade. So I tell you what, I'll give you this carb, because bacteria on its own can't generate any food. They just have to cling to something basically and wait for carbon to wash past them, which they grab. So that's all they're doing. The bacteria are attracted to the moisture in the soil, which is then fed by the carbohydrates from the plants, and then it will get a food source from that. And then by doing that, it will use its enzymes to break down other things the plant can't do on its own, and sort of there's this back and forth relationship. So all you're really trying to do is keep that soil evenly moist, so the soil life is constantly sort of thriving. It's not sort of spiking up and down. And on the back of that, it's not like when you're feeding, and you know, some guys will go and they'll feed every day, some people will do it every 3 or 4 days, some people go on drippers, but with living soil, it's just constantly on, and the plant can just feed at any moment it wants to feed. It doesn't need to sort of wait for you to feed it. So it just allows the plant to be just a lot more in control of its own health and its own, you know, just eating, really, I guess, if you want to call it that. And, you know, let's face it, I think we'd all be much happier if we were in control of what we eat rather than someone just stuffing stuff in our food whenever we want it, whether we want it or not. So yeah, that's the main difference between sort of soil and pots and beds. Dev, I don't know if maybe you can talk a little bit about the old allotment, because obviously you're not doing sort of like a full living style yet, but that's the intention, isn't it? Just keep improving that soil as you go, keep adding to it and building to it, and that'd be nice to hear about.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the whole idea, really, of like a living system. I guess it's just always adding into it stuff that's just going to improve it, really. I mean, that's the idea what Ben mentioned about using sort of pumice, I guess, over perlite, whereas, you know, eventually that will break down, just like perlite takes longer, but when it does break down, it's adding minerals to the soil rather than just basically breaking down into an inert sort of compound that's not going to do anything. So it's the same sort of thing, really. It's just always just adding stuff that's going to be beneficial, like putting the plant matter back into it, sort of that you're cutting down each season and stuff. Yeah, man, like it's just.
But that's it. That's what you're doing as a living soil grower. You're not feeding the plant. You're feeding the soil, and especially if you want to keep it long term. Think about that, building that over time. And the easiest thing to make that decision on is, well, what am I going to feed it and why? And is it going to improve the health and why? And how do you answer that question? Well, what is it? Where does it come from? And all I really want to do is get things into it to firstly add diversity and add something that's a nutrient accumulator. It has nutrition within it, and it isn't just one particular. You know, like I said, I can go and buy gypsum and it's calcium and sulfate, and that's it. Where I can use kelp, and kelp's got everything in it. It's from the sea. It's got all 85 minerals on a periodic table in it. You know, I can use basalt likewise. I can use all these things we use have got a multi-beneficial. And that's why when it comes to, like we said, mulch, the reason why we use a mulch, I don't know if you're familiar with a mulch layer. So the rule is when you use living soil, never ever have bare soil. As soon as you have bare soil, it's degrading. The way to continue building soil for the future is always keep it covered. The way to keep it covered is two ways. Either living mulch, like a cover crop. You probably have cover crops where you can just plant like some sort of legume, or pretty much anything actually, Josh, because the stuff you've got growing out your things, you've got all sorts. Literally, I don't know if you want to tell people about what you've got in your mix.
I've got dill, coriander, clover, marigolds. What else?
All sorts. What else?
I've got loads.
You even have veggies and some radishes.
Radish.
Like literally, so
Literally
he's got his
any-
beds, but it's got everything else in it. And people think, oh, but that's going to draw nutrition from your soil. Yeah, but only if your soil's got no nutrition in it. If your soil's got abundant nutrition, don't worry about it. Feed the world. And then all you're doing is these plants are drawing the nutrition from your soil, which you then harvest, drop back on the soil, and it just returns anyway. So there's no waste. But the diversity is key, because then you get different plants will partner with different kinds of microbes, and then you get different blends of microbes, and look at that. It's always the best way. A wildflower meadow is always going to be more healthy than someone just planting barley or something when it comes to all different levels of species. It's just the way it works. So diversity is key. Do you want to say something, Dev?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. Diversity, obviously, it's the way forward, isn't it? Like, I mean, a guy on my allotment, he told us that, you know, you can't plant trees because trees just suck all the life out of the soil and nothing can grow around them. But it's like, obviously, when you go to a forest, there's just stuff growing everywhere, isn't there? It's just, you know, it's this sort of weird myth that I think we have, that, you know, you can only grow certain things in one place and nothing else can survive. As you've said, it'll suck the nutrients out, and it's not the way. It's, you know, again, it's having this thought of like feeding the soil, not the plants. You know, it can take what it wants. It's been doing it for a long time, so definitely, you know, it just seems like the natural way to do it, and you see the results sort of coming through in the end result, in the end product. So.
Well, that's what will happen, you see. I don't know if you've seen the demo over on the EcoThrive booth at the back there. We've got just a classic indoor setup where it's a metre square tray, 4 40-litre pots in it, 10-gallon pots of living soil with worms in them, and just covered with a layer of hay. And you can lift the hay up and you see the worms are up there working the surface, and they're laying a layer of worm castings. So every time you're watering it, you're watering those worm castings in. So think about, okay, so what am I feeding the soil? You're kind of feeding the soil, but you're feeding the worms, because you kind of end up growing in a worm bin. But worms are magic. If you go and test any soil out in nature, the soil that's got the most worms in it will be the most fertile, guaranteed. So that's all you really want to try and do, is encourage worm growth, because once they're in your soil, they will come up and break down anything that's on top and bring that into your soil. So then think about what you're feeding worms. Well, you can lay straw and you can lay hay, and it will do a job. It will keep the soil covered, like I said, it will keep the moisture in, it will create that decomposition layer and make nature start working, but it won't add much nutrition to your soil. So then you've got to think, well, what kind of plants are nutritious? And that's what what we call a nutrient accumulator, so something that actually can put its roots really, really deep, find minerals that other things can't, bring it up and store it itself. And that's when, you know, a little bit of knowledge comes in. But if you can understand a bit of, you know, what are the good plants that contain the good multi-nutritional stuff, then you can aim for those. The best things we have in the UK is comfrey, nettles, and alfalfa, called lucerne here. If you can grow that, it's really easy to grow. They're basically weeds themselves. You can go and wild harvest them yourself every year. But that's the sort of stuff that, start introducing that to your beds and just build them up. Literally just at the end of the autumn or whenever you get this stuff, just pile it on top, keep layering it, keep layering it, keep layering it. Ideally, if you can create layers like a lasagna of that green material and then some like a proper aged compost to sort of create layers, that'll really speed up that decomposition process. But that's what you think about. Think of what you can feed it. And that's why these guys on the scene, people like Dragonfly Earth Medicine, you know, they make products with stuff we can't get in it. It's like it's got horsetail here, which is a really bit higher in silica, or it's got yarrow and wild yam and things that we can't get here. So that's why we use things like that, so just to add that diversity. So that's all we're ever trying to do really as living soil growers. Think long term, think about how we can actually, you know, do more with less, and sort of really just whenever we have a question, we go back and ask nature. Every time we try and use a mineral, we try and make sure it comes from a sustainable source. You know, even when you go into the garden centre, you know, or in their organic section, you can see what they have is fertilizers. It's 99% the chance going to be some sort of waste animal products. It'll be a blood meal or a bone meal or a feather meal or a hoof or a horn meal. And these guys, although it's organic because it's from an animal, the places where they get this stuff from, those animals are definitely not organic, right? They're going to be from, if you're buying waste material, it's cheap here. You're buying it from the cheapest place you can find. It's going to be the cheapest source, and they're going to have the worst standards, and it's going to be the worst animals. It's going to be full of GMO. It's going to be full of growth hormones and antibiotics and stuff. So, you know, and that stuff, it's okay if you want a really quick boost of nutrition, but it gives you a food spike and then it's gone. Like a lot of the bottled organic companies, it just gives you that food spike. But like I said, we'd much rather just build it all in at the start with, let the plant start interacting with that soil life, let it start